proposal is expected to show how far he has moved away from his 2016 so-called campaign promises that he campaigned on but never delivered on. The budget proposal 45 will release Monday is expected to lay bare how much he has adjusted to the political and practical limits of Washington, with some of his biggest campaign failures from 2016 cast aside and replaced with more limited policy ambitions. On immigration, healthcare, infrastructure, and the deficit, the final budget pitch of 45's first term will look much different from the campaign platform he offered 4 years ago. The border wall that he promised would be paid by Mexico is not being built, and it's not being paid by Mexico. Is instead being financed by billions in the U.S. taxpayer dollars, and the administration budget request to Congress is expected to seek even more. The squatter's 2015 promise to protect Medicaid from cuts has been repeatedly ignored as he sought to slash some $800 billion over a decade from the health program for low-income Americans. The latest evidence of this came on Saturday when he wrote on Twitter that the budget proposal will not be touching your Social Security or Medicare. He made no mention of protecting Medicaid, even though he had vowed to guard it during his first squatter wall campaign. He also is seeking to gut the Affordable Care Act, though the courts, despite pledging to safeguard one of its key tenets, insurance coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. During the 2016 campaign, 45 vowed to deliver a major infrastructure plan that has technically not been put through yet. But there has been virtually no progress on that issue. The squatters' promise to eliminate the government's roughly $20 trillion debt within 8 years has also gone unfulfilled, which I knew it would. Instead, 45 has added almost $3 trillion to the debt in 3 years, and that number is only expected to balloon, according to nonpartisan estimates. Proposals to cut domestic programs have evaporated the massive year-end budget deals with Congress that have actually raised spending limits. 45's first budget proposal relied on questionable math when it sought to eliminate the budget deficit after 10 years, but even that goal has slipped out of reach. 45 has scored a string of victories in recent months, including securing a bipartisan revamp of the North American Free Trade Agreement. Technically, I don't even consider that a victory. It was nothing more than a fucking rewrite for NAFTA. And being acquitted, which technically, even though he was acquitted, but still means he's still fucking guilty. By Republicans in the Senate on impeachment charges, he signed a partial trade deal with China, and technically that deal was pretty shitty. And marshaled through a massive tax cut package in 2017. But Monday's budget proposal will demonstrate that number of the squatters' loftiest campaign promises from 4 years ago have largely been abandoned because of political realities, as well as simple budget math. I have no idea how he can live up to his campaign promises to reduce the deficit, not address entitlement programs, and at the same time cut taxes, said Bill Hoagland, my Republican who served as staff director for the Senate Budget Committee. I have not figured out how to spare this circle, and neither have they. White House officials have declined to comment on this article, but the squatter has sought to seize on a range of accomplishments as affirmation that his governing style is delivering results for Americans, which it's not. The White House officials claim and argued that the strong economy is lifting wages for workers across the income distribution, which it's not. We are advancing with unbridled optimism and lifting high our citizens of every race, color, religion, and creed. The squatter in his clan speech of the Union address. Technically, it's not. As a squatter candidate in 2016, 45 pledged time and time again that Mexico would pay for his border wall, which they're not. It was a promise he's also sporadically made a squatter at times, suggesting that the renegotiated North American trade deal would somehow finance the barrier's construction, which it's not, though without really explaining how, because he doesn't really have that in place. The Mexican government has rejected the notion of playing any role in paying for the squatter for the wall, and 45's budgets have not yet proposed pulling the money from Mexico. Instead, U.S. taxpayers are spending upward of $20 billion for the border wall between money appropriated by Congress and funds 45 has taken from the Pentagon budget by declaring a national emergency at the border, which it really isn't. That trend is expected to continue in the budget due out on Monday. On infrastructure, 45 has repeatedly made promises of a $1 trillion infrastructure plan, but his last budget proposed only a $200 billion federal investment toward that goal while cutting infrastructure spending in other areas. He has flirted with making an infrastructure deal with Democrats only to have those efforts fizzle because they don't agree with that, on that part of how he's trying to do it. The notion of a White House Infrastructure Week has become a standing joke on Capitol Hill, and despite a renewed promise in the Klan Union address and a new sound of talks involving Treasury Secretary Steve Dumbass Mnuchin, congressional Democrats have little hope that the infrastructure deal will actually materialize. I hope that this budget's different, and in particular, I would hope that it is different in the infrastructure area where the squatters talked such a good game, said Representative David David E. Price, who's a Democrat from North Carolina, a senior member of the House Appropriations Committee, but so far we've seen very little. Squatterable budgets are an annual tradition that spell out the White House's vision for the government. Congress often casts many of these ideas aside, but the documents are supposed to serve as the opening offer, for budget negotiations later in the year. But even more so than under prior administrations, 45's budget proposals have been largely rejected by lawmakers who have agreed on a bipartisan basis to restore and even increase spending for agencies and programs that the administration has tried to cut, including healthcare, education programs, foreign aid, and Social Security. 45 in the past few years have sought to backpedal on some of the proposed budget cuts, facing blowback after seeking to cut funding in states central to his re-election campaign, such as Michigan. That has led to some dejection among career officials at agencies and within the White House Office of Management and Budget, who are forced to devote enormous time and attention to developing a budget document they know Congress will largely reject. According to several people with knowledge of internal administration dynamics who spoke on the condition of anonymity to describe them. In prior years, 45's budgets have reflected the irreconcilable contradictions of his campaign promises, in part by relying on overly rosy economic forecasts and glossing over how he would achieve big cuts. In 2017, 45's budget predicted that economic growth would surge to an annual rate of 3% by 2021 and stay at that rate indefinitely. This goal has proved elusive. The economy grew 2.9% in 2018, but slowed to 2.3% last year, and is projected to slow even be more slower this year. Relying on rosy economic estimates in the budget plans allow the White House to assume that prospering families and companies will generate high levels of tax revenue as a way to offset the widening deficit. Instead, the deficit estimates have proved faulty. 45's budgets have also proposed enormous cuts to domestic spending programs as a way to bring the deficit down, but non-defense domestic spending, aside from what are considered mandatory programs, makes up just a sliver of the overall $4.6 trillion federal budget. Mandatory programs, including the domestic programs, Medicare and Social Security, make up more than 60% of federal spending. And since 45 has promised repeatedly to wall off Medicare and Social Security from cuts, while also increasing the Pentagon and Department of Homeland Security budgets, he has fewer agencies available for cuts if he wants to seek reductions. Representative Charles Fleischmann, who's a Republican from Tennessee, a member of the Appropriations Committee, said the deficit cannot be addressed until Congress and the administration take on entitlement programs such as Medicare and Social Security, but he noted that 45 has promised to protect those programs, and I will certainly respect that, 45 has no intentions of protecting the Social Security and Medicare. He wants to get rid of those. So I think right now, this year is probably not the year to deal with the mandatory side of the equation, Fleischmann said. But perhaps that's something that 45 will look at with the Congress in his second term if he ever makes it, which he probably won't. The squatter and his aides have also said the GOP tax cut of 2017 would pay for itself, meaning that it would create so much new tax revenue because of growth that there would not be an impact on the deficit. This production has not yet come true, critics say. The Congressional Budget Office recently said that annual deficits would top $1 trillion in 2020 for the first time since 2012, and that the tax cuts have led to a reduction in new revenue. Smaller promises have also proved unworkable, as a squatter 45 repeatedly promised to save the federal government $300 billion a year by allowing the United States to negotiate lower prescription drug prices, saying on day one we'll solve that issue. 45 later backed off his promise to have Medicare negotiate for lower drug prices, although nonpartisan experts had dismissed the claim that $300 billion could be saved annually, and the impeachment drama has also forced the administration to shift course past attempts to cut a State Department foreign aid program for Ukraine that was at the center of the impeachment inquiry are being abandoned this year, although the administration is likely to pursue cuts up to other State Department programs in line with the squatter's well-known distaste for foreign aid. 45 has talked publicly about wanting to cut spending. He has also signaled an indifference toward the federal budget. During the Obama administration, the White House budget proposal was typically released at a high-profile news conference featuring members of the cabinet and top aides. 45 administration officials have done less to market and tout their budget document, and 45 rarely speaks to it because basically they're fucking everything up on that. Leaked audio from a dinner that Squatter attended in January with donors at Mar-a-Lago, his private resort in Florida, captured the Squatter brushing aside those who are critical of rising defense and federal spending as part of the growing national debt. Who the hell cares about the budget? We're going to have a country, the Squatter said. Technically, in order to have a country, you have to have a fucking budget, and you're fucking everything up, you dumb hick. This is why he needs to. This is why we cannot afford to have him in a second term. He's going to fuck everything up even more.